Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join in. Welcome everyone to today's King's Expert Series webinar on Cities of the Future. This webinar is part of an online event series for our global alumni community. Each month you'll have the opportunity to tune in and hear from some of our leading academics, research and practitioners on some of the most important issues of our time. If you missed any of our recent webinars, you can catch up at any time on the King's Alumni YouTube channel. Today, you'll be hearing from our expert panel as they share their perspectives and experiences on our cities. What impact has the pandemic and this seemingly never-ending lockdown had on our cities? Will things eventually go back to what they were, or have our ways of working and navigating our work and social lives changed for good? Now, you've probably already read their bios, but I'll briefly remind you who we have with us here today on our panel. Professor Philip Hubbard is Professor of Urban Studies at King's. He previously worked in the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Work at the University of Kent, serving as Head of School and Associate Dean for Research in the Faculty of Social Sciences. Professor Katharine Willis is Professor in Smart Cities and Communities at the University of Plymouth and currently a Visiting Research Fellow at the Centre for Urban Science and Progress at King's. Our chair for today's webinar is Professor Mark Kleinman. Mark is Professor of Public Policy and Director of Analysis at the Policy Institute. He's been a government advisor at the No. 10 Strategy Unit, a civil servant and a policy director for all 3 London mayors. Just a few quick notes about the format of the discussion before I hand over to our chair for today. Following introductions from our panel, we'll then turn to questions from our audience. Thank you to those who've already submitted questions in advance. We have those on hand. If you do have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Do keep in mind that since we've got so many of you on the call today, we might not be able to get to every single question. You can also participate by pressing the like button next to other people's questions so that we can see which questions are the most popular. As usual, you're welcome to continue the debate on all of our topics throughout the series on LinkedIn. Be sure to use the hashtag King's Expert Series. I'll now hand over to our chair for today, Professor Mark Kleinman.
Marika, thank you very much. And good evening, everyone, or depending on where you're watching this from, good morning or good afternoon. I'm just going to make a few introductory remarks and then I'm going to pass over to my 2 colleagues to hear their perspectives on this fascinating topic. The 21st century was supposed to be the century of the city. Sometime early in this century, the world passed an important milestone where more than half the world's population were now living in cities, with a forecast that by 2050, that would rise to be about 2/3 of the population. And as well as this general process of urbanization, we've also seen over the last 20 or 30 years or so, the rise of what one could call the megacity or perhaps the global city. That is a relatively small group of places, including London, which have thrived for the last 30 years or so as key nodes of the global system, attractors of talent, ideas, and investment. And along with that, increasing concerns about inequality, both within cities and between successful and less successful places, and about environmental and other impacts. Now, the global pandemic seems to have checked this irresistible rise of the city. Many of the very advantages, particularly of global cities, that is their connectivity, their density, the proximity of people and ideas and activity, now actually appear as vulnerabilities as well as assets. What does this mean for cities in the future? Should we be preparing for a future which is less dense, which is deconcentrated, which is based on more dispersed patterns of activity and location? Or should we see this rather as simply the next stage in the adaptation of cities to different challenges and opportunities of modern life? Should we, perhaps under the impact of technology and particular sorts of technologies, do we need to start thinking about cities in a rather different way? These are huge topics, but we hope over the next hour or so to give you plenty of food for thought on these and related subjects. I'm going to pass over now to my colleague, Philip Hubbard, to give his perspective on these issues. Philip.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So we're looking here at large urban debates, and already I think we can see in the literature, the vast literature around the future of cities and what form the post-COVID city might take, but there are some quite extreme views being spoken. One article I saw back in August last year was from Helen Kuklellis, who wrote that the post-COVID city is not going to be very different than the pre-COVID one. And she imagined a future where we look back on, with wry amusement on the idea that cities might have ever needed reinventing. In her sense, it's just a kind of a minor blip in the history of cities. At the other extreme, we find people who think this is something of a pivotal moment in the history of cities. Richard Florida is perhaps the best example here. And he writes that even when the short-term social scarring of COVID disappears, cities are going to be fundamentally different in the future, that we're going to see infrared thermal screening controlling our every move, and that all our buildings, our streets will be redesigned to accommodate social distancing. Inevitably, I sit somewhere in between. I don't think COVID is a great reset, but nor do I think it's just a temporary blip in the life of cities. And what I'm kind of coming around to is the idea that COVID, in a sense, represents a period that we might look back on as a period of urban acceleration, a period of acceleration that's hastened a number of polarizing urban tendencies that, in a sense, we've known about for decades. And here I particularly want to focus on some things that I've focused on in my work: the death of the high street, the exodus of middle-class families from the central city, and the privatisation of public space. And I'm going to relate these to the example of London, because I guess that many of you will know that example. Now, the data that we have relating to London in the first lockdown period suggests that the moment the lockdown comes along, we have an immediate and drastic 95% reduction of footfall in inner London. And that when lockdown was lifted in the summer, recovery was incredibly slow and partial. It was much quicker in the outer boroughs of London. So realistically, I think we need to suspect that daily commuting is never going to recover in London to pre-COVID levels. The numbers working in London who will in the future live 70, 90, 100 minutes from the capital and travelling once or twice a week will rise dramatically. And because there are going to be fewer daily commuters out there, footfall in the central areas of the city and the West End will remain low. The retail and leisure landscape will contract further. Falling retail rents is going to lead to former shops and department stores, in particular in the city centre, to be converted into housing. And I think that much of this is going to be in the form of micro apartments for the working poor that lack any space for socialising or exercise. At the same time, I think we are going to see increased levels of surveillance of other street spaces. And some of this will be justified with reference to public health. And this is going to diminish the role of the streets as civic spaces of encounter. Urban public spaces, I think, will be gradually replaced by privately owned public spaces with airport security. And if any of you have been to the Sky Garden at the top of the walkie-talkie building in the City of London, you know the type of model that I'm talking about. Because of this, the demands placed on open green spaces in the city, I think, are going to become quite extreme. The perception that inner city parks are becoming overcrowded, overutilised, is going to help to further fuel the flight of middle-class families from the centre of London, and they're going to move increasingly to the wider southeast and the suburbs, seeking homes with private gardens. The data that we already know about suggests that more people moved out of London than last year than at any other time in the last decade, and that the average distance that somebody is moving from London has gone up from 28 miles in 2019 to 40 miles, and that this is contributing to the revival and rising house prices in some market towns in the southeast. So I don't think any of this is fundamentally going to undermine London. I think that London's undoubtedly going to remain a leading world city. There's a thickness of cultural and economic institutions in the capital. It will remain a good place in which to do business. But collectively, I think these kind of micro-geographical trends point to a less convivial and more divided city, where social sustainability may well become compromised in the name of short-term capital accumulation and economic recovery. And for example, here I know we've got national space standards for new homes in Britain, and we've had them for decades. But our research suggests that today nearly 1 in 10 of London homes is smaller than a minimum of 37 square metres for a 1-bedroom flat. And that's the size of a small Travelodge room. A rush to replace shops in the capital with small but ultimately very profitable compact housing is only going to make things worse. And if lockdown has shown us something, it's shown us that building decent homes probably matters more than building affordable homes. In that sense, I guess I can't offer much in terms of optimism in relation to post-COVID city. But what I hope for is that the experience of lockdown is making some groups look at their local environment in a new way, and that this might lead them to contest the acceleration that we're seeing of urban neoliberalism, as we might term it. Here I'm talking not just about people who live in rabbit hutch homes who struggle to keep healthy and sane during lockdown. I'm also talking here about those racialised ethnic groups whose precarious housing and insecure work has disproportionately exposed them to the virus. And I guess I think I'm also talking about those young people who've begun to realise that once you shut down clubs, pubs and coffee shops, the city actually offers very little opportunity for play or expression beyond a daily exercise. And if this is the case, I hope that post-COVID, we might begin to see a kind of younger generation in particular working more vigorously to ensure that underutilised spaces in our cities are given over to common or cooperative ownership, providing opportunities for citizens to reunite with their bodies, with nature and with each other through activities like urban gardening, playful participation and all manner of creative and useful doing. And so I'll finish here by just noting that when many urbanists have been asked in recent months about what their blueprint for the post-COVID city is, they all seem to be offer a fairly similar, what I would call greenwashed image. It's of tree-lined, bike-dominated urban corridors and pop-up restaurants. I don't think that's very radical, and I think that will play into a gentrification agenda that's already in place. I think what I'm suggesting is a more radical repurposing of our city centres, an emphasis on use value rather than exchange value. So what I want to see, I think, in the post-COVID city is the top floor of every city centre municipal car park, which is currently not being used and is not likely to be used in the future, converted into a space for basketball, five-a-side football or street games. I want to see all the Debenhams which are now abandoned, becoming flexible music performance spaces and homeless shelters. I want to see sterile urban plazas replaced by urban forests, allotments and apiaries that are going to make city centres generally greener and more therapeutic spaces that will draw people in from the suburbs. Now, I don't think any of that is going to happen, of course. And instead, I think we're going to see local authorities trying to save high streets by propping up failing retail. At the same time, the developers are turning former department stores into profitable rabbit hutch homes. But that said, I think if we've got another 6 months of lockdown and COVID-19 disproportionately impacting on urban minoritized groups, I think that should probably focus our minds just a little bit better on how fixing the city might be the first step towards fixing our unequal society.
Thank you, Philip, for a really inspiring talk. So I'm going to move on now to sort of draw again on some of the things Philip talked about in terms of ideas of microgeography, and draw on how we might also see the impact of technology that's taken place during COVID and how that might reshape how we think about what the city might be. So just to sort of start with, I'd just like people to think about the place they're in now and where they've been living during COVID, and whether their viewpoint of that neighbourhood in which they're living has changed over the last year and how they've connected. I'm going to argue to some extent that big cities have failed us during the pandemic. It's been fairly clear that they haven't been able to cope with the crisis of COVID, and that instead we need to think much more about what I would call smarter and healthier neighbourhoods, so working at a neighbourhood scale. Cities have always been places of connectivity, whether that's social or digital, and that's where people choose to live there. But as I said, COVID has really exposed the density and proximity, which has been how cities have often been characterised as being the most vulnerable aspect. And one of the ways that we can see how the future of cities is almost already here is how we've used the value of sort of collective intelligence during COVID to reconsider what it means to live in a neighbourhood. So mutual aid, volunteering, and the use of technological networks that support this, like WhatsApp groups, video calls, Facebook support, they've all provided this benefits of linking our social environment and digital networks in urban areas. So we've started to merge the digital and physical into the spaces in which we work. I mean, an example is this now, we're on Zoom we're also in some sort of lived space, and we're operating at the two at the same time. So this idea of what neighbourliness mean in the time where we both connect both digitally and physically. And I think if we look on the example of London, I think a 2018 survey showed that only 32% of people would describe their neighbourhood as 30% people did describe their neighbourhoods as strangers. And one of the things that has happened during COVID is sort of increase of what we might call local social capital, something that Jane Jacobs in The Death and Life of American Cities talked about as what makes a neighbourhood work. So the everyday activities and interaction, and the way that we build up this network of relationship that provides a sort of foundation for mutual trust, shared efforts and resilience. And those strong and weak ties that also Putnam talks about are really what makes us able to survive through emergencies, the people we can rely on. And what we've seen is the way that the digital has also started to reinforce that. So what we're looking at is if we think about cities as sort of spatially proximate and dense, and that's their value, actually a network society, so we move into this idea of networks, and I'm talking about networks here in both a social and a digital sense, how they create new patterns of how we connect, and how those patterns of connection are what we should start to be thinking about, and that to some extent disintegrates sort of proximate ideas of the city as a physically, spatially connected space. For example, we now use during COVID many ways to connect that perform neighbourliness. We've got video calling, where 7 in 10 adults now make online weekly video calls. If you're in any sort of work environment, that's probably 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 of your life is spent on a video call. But in the contrast, we've also got this rise of the mutual aid groups in both rural and urban areas. And really that sort of sustained us in overcoming the sort of diversity and also particularly some of the inequalities we've mentioned. And interestingly, those mutual aid groups have often had to use, but have used digital platforms. So they have not destroyed, community has not been destroyed through that, but neighbourliness, working locally, has actually been also mediated through a digital. So if we're thinking about the fragility of cities as being really exposed, we can start to rethink cities as much more networked spaces, which may not exist as a physically dense form, and perhaps they might start to disintegrate out into a sense of cityness, but that might operate at multiple layers of spatiality. I think something that's come up recently is this big rise of this talk around something called the 15-minute city, where the idea is that all our amenities are somehow within some sort of 15-minute radius. But that really collapses back into this very sort of narrow-minded, again, quite sort of middle-class idea of a city as something where everything's around us. And actually, what we've seen in the pandemic is a lot of the services which you might see, or the commonality of space in which we would class as being important in a city, has been collapsed into the digital. And so how can we start to think about that our spaces around us operating at multiple scales and multiple levels? And I'm just going to mention a couple of projects that I'm working on as maybe examples of what that might mean in terms of not a very sort of utopian vision of city, but a rather down to earth. So we've got a project in Plymouth, which is regionally quite unequal. There's lots of patterns of inequality in Plymouth. And we've looked at the way in which community centres or spaces also create places which are really important resources, and how they might also operate on a digital level. So providing people access to computing equipment so they can overcome the sort of digital divides in which some people now fall. We've seen the issue with schools recently. And also opening up a public Wi-Fi network within that physical space so that people can both connect digitally and connect physically to provide that sort of mutual aid support. And another project I'm working on is called Green Minds, which is looking at another thing that's been revealed through COVID, is how parks and green spaces are not sort of merely incidental access to nature, but they are part of how we sort of contribute to well-being in the city in the future, and how that proximate nature of them is quite important, but also just how we enable green space to be part of not just, again, the idea of a sort of natural environment, but also part of a sort of way we manage our well-being. So we're looking at how green space might become something that everybody owns within the city and we take much more responsibility for, and how we can use digital technology to also create new patterns of connection with green space. So I'm going to leave with a sort of final set of things to think about, is how the idea of the city as a dense and connected space, and how that as a resource and a social resource that builds on a sort of idea of social capital, how we might also think about ideas of digital capital, and how the city might become much more distributed in the way in which we see it, and move out into patterns of connection which enable us to act and work together for a sort of future sense of social and sort of community capital.
Great, thank you both very much. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about COVID and London and COVID and cities. But I think I've got more new ideas in the last 10 minutes from listening to my two colleagues than I probably have over the last few weeks. So there are numerous things I could pick up on there. One thing that struck me about both your presentations is that I think both of you were fairly convinced that the city wasn't going to disappear. So that the idea of kind of deconcentration of population and activity is pretty far-fetched. But at the same time, I think you set forth fairly radical ideas of how we might change the way we think about cities. In other words, the response to COVID going a long way beyond a few more bike lanes and a bit of greening, but actually thinking about the city in really quite a different way and at different sorts of levels. So I'd like to kind of ask a little bit more about both those visions. So if I start with Philip, I think, although you said you thought it was unlikely to happen, I also picked up that you thought, this was the chance for really some quite radical thinking about what the future of the city might be like. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think in terms of those ideas of dispersed urbanism, I think we've been established those ideas for quite some time. The idea that London doesn't stop at the M25, that London is a global city, but also to start thinking about how London itself is made up of the patterns of commuting, the daily kind of commutes in of all sorts of workers, be they those who are very much involved in the producer services and finance, but also the kind of the servicing class who've been increasingly forced to migrate in from fairly large distances from some of the more affordable pockets of urban housing in outer London and the wider home counties because of gentrification of the inner core and the rise of the kind of creative class. So I think that kind of dispersed pattern of urbanism is something we've understood for quite some time. I think what this might encourage us to think about is why that pattern has evolved, how that relates to particular structures whereby cities seem to serve the global elite who are incredibly footloose, and how that restricts the mobility and the life chances of some groups who seem to have a particular stuckness in place, and a stuckness that is often illustrated with reference to, for example, their vulnerability to the virus and to COVID. So I think as we begin to acknowledge these kind of new spatialities and the idea that cities are exploding outwards at the same time that in certain ways they're contracting inwards in terms of a reconcentration of poverty in the core, for example. I think that might get us to think about the spatiality of cities in new ways and to really just think about those social polarizations, not on a kind of borough by borough or city by city scale, but think about how that exists within a kind of unequal relationality. And there I would think about the work of the late Doreen Massey and how important that might have been to geographers in thinking about London as a world city, and how we need to just think about COVID's geographies in relation to that kind of dispersed sense of agency.
Okay, Philip, that's great. And Katharine, you talked about the relationship between the digital and I don't want to say real, but I'm going to say real just for the sake of it. And while you acknowledge that perhaps we're all looking forward to slightly fewer Zoom calls, when we're through the pandemic, you also at various points talked about some of the positives of digital connection, and how in fact, I hadn't heard this kind of view really expressed so well before, that digital can reinforce some of the existing real world or community contacts rather than being always its enemy. Could you say a little bit more about that, about how digital communication can help us even when we don't need to make Zoom calls quite as often?
Yeah, so there tends to be this sort of false binary that somehow the real world is somehow different from the digital. And what I was trying to emphasize through this is that we are very social in the way we connect digitally. In fact, the digital is an incredibly socially connected, so that it can also have huge patterns of inequality. So that's not saying that the same inequalities we see in the physical space don't get reproduced in the digital space. Who can access who can access digital networks is also to do with, whether you can afford the right technology, whether you have the same access points, so that those inequalities do occur. But I do think it's important to think about how the digital also reinforces, I sort of try to use this term digital capital, which is sort of taking on the idea of Putnam's social capital. And interestingly, Putnam, who wrote this book, Bowling Alone, which looked at the social capital idea, really debugged this idea that the digital is somehow dividing us and is not, and actually it was things like cars and television that were really the most divisive, and that the digital, the internet, has actually provided us with new patterns of connection. So I think we need to think carefully about the reality of our lived lives, and whether green space is a really good example. So we cannot imagine that the way we connect with a green space might also involve some pattern of digital, because we tend to have this binary that the natural world and the digital world can somehow never coexist. But in fact, they do all the time. We spend time with our headphones on while we're in a green space. So I think I'd like to first of all collapse that binary of the digital and the physical somehow operating against each other, and they're not an or, there's an and that if we use the benefits of both, we can sort of bring in the benefits of how we might connect through multiple levels and sort of merge them together in a much more of a hybrid type space.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I'm going to turn now to one or two of the questions that are coming in from the audience. And one of the questions was about what the panel, which I guess includes me, thinks will be the impact of home working in the smart cities of the future. And I think one aspect of that, which you've both talked about so far, is the kind of dispersal out of London and out of similar type cities to a wider hinterland, if you like. But is it reasonable to think that some jobs can be performed not just outside the city, but indeed in another city, in another country, or on another continent? So what do we think about the impact of home working on a really radical dispersal of jobs, not just within an urban area, but at a kind of global scale? And I'll go to Philip first on this.
No, I think that the conditions are now there for people to do more and more homework. And I think one of the things we've learned from lockdown was that although there was a great concern about the fact that people working at home was going to cause a huge drop in productivity, businesses began to learn that, it may be the Hawthorne effect, I think, in the sense that people knew that this was a kind of a new era, and they had to kind of prove themselves, and people worked a little bit harder than usual, and the novelty of working at home, and just simple things like the ability to be able to sit and work in your pajamas all day. This encouraged people to kind of become more productive. And in the short term, we saw companies really happy with the fact that productivity was not particularly impacted. So they were quite happy to encourage home working, and clearly at stages where there was not a strict lockdown and people could have been encouraged back to work, many companies didn't do so. But to maintain those levels of productivity, people have worked harder and harder. And rather than kind of losing the kind of the, you know, they've lost the 9 to 5 and the long, lengthy commute in many cases, but they haven't particularly gained because more and more of their life is being intruded on by work. So the boundaries between home and work begin to collapse. So I think we will see a kind of reaction to this. In the survey that we did of Londoners who are working at home, of course, the one thing that many people said they missed about work was the things that make, you know, work gives back in terms of companionship and face-to-face contact. And that's why I think that there will be a dispersal, but I think that people will want to remain where they are able to work at home. They will want to be able to come back in for face-to-face meetings, and the buzz of London will always be enough, I think, to draw them back in. I think that's also the case. I saw another question there is about how does this relate to smaller cities? I think that relates to all of our core cities. I think the patterns of daily commuting will empty out. There will be more dispersal. So Birmingham, Manchester, Edinburgh, it will apply to them as well. But those places will maintain a certain vitality because people will still want to congregate within them and meet for the purpose of face-to-face interaction, project working, and the type of stuff that gives work a kind of more meaning to people beyond just the paycheck at the end of the month.
Okay, I'll go to Katharine in a moment, but I can't resist asking if anybody's got a plan for the return to work where we maximise the corridor conversations and the conviviality and the gossip and reduce the number of long committee meetings and so on. Please do send it in. Katharine.
Yeah, so interestingly, I'll go back to the digital again as another way in which this, well, homework is an obvious collapse because the digital enables that, because we can take our work wherever that chooses to be, and that the home is a place that is more convenient for us to, well, obviously in COVID, it's not just convenient, it's necessary. But if the digital enables us to collapse activities in which we perform our lives, whether we want to have that or not, COVID has proved that that's possible, entirely possible. That this distinction between homework didn't need to be created through different rooms and different buildings, but actually could be collapsed into the space of our screen. An interesting example is, you know, the rural. So people choose to live where maybe neighbourliness is best supported. I'm not talking about the 15-minute city idea, but maybe where we have access to spaces of support, maybe through family networks or through access to green space. Those things become a sort of new way in which we want to live our lives, and we bring the digital enables us to collapse our work into a better pattern of well-being and home space. That can happen anywhere we choose to define as a city. So I would argue that cityness is something that we take with us and is a capacity and also an access, because that means that there are people who have the financial and the sort of social standing ability, particularly within their jobs, to have that level of mobility. So the consequence is that the people who are still required to go to a physical space to work, you know, work in a supermarket or are a nurse, you know, those, or a hairdresser, for example, those things, those material things still get placed and they still have to happen somewhere. So there's a really, you know, the global world of finance and work and possibly your university, we have this sense that we can move them to places that we choose to be in. Whereas many people don't have that choice, and they will be physically much more stuck, as it were, much more linked to the physical, where their material world is much more bounded to a particular place. So I think we'll start to see this sort of much more, you know, fluid mobility of those that can choose to move, and the digital, and then choosing to be in a place in which they want to be, and other, again, maybe a divide with some people who are left behind in that process. So I think that's an interesting point to see how that will pan out in not particularly a positive way in some aspects.
Okay, thanks, Katharine. And just picking up really on the last point you made, my own response to that question is that I think the world is both flat and spiky. So Thomas Friedman wrote a book 15 years ago or so saying, you know, the world is flat, meaning if you've got a laptop and a reasonable internet connection, there are a lot of places you can go to. You don't have to be necessarily in the middle of London or New York. But as Richard Florida has shown, we have quite a spiky world. We have a small number of places which do very well out of that globalization because they attract talent, they have the kind of deep assets, they have the connectivity. And I think both those things will continue to be true. So while a lot of jobs could be done in a number of different places, I think there will be a pattern of which jobs concentrate where. And as both my colleagues have said, you get a very differentiated pattern and a rather unequal pattern emerging from that. And I think that's going to be one of the big public policy issues post-pandemic. Another spin being given to this cycle of inequality, which we've seen in a number of places. All right, I'd like to move on to a slightly different topic because we've had a couple of questions which really relate to the role of cities in promoting health. And the first one is, to what extent do we think the spread of COVID has actually been exacerbated by the rise of mega cities? Philip.
I mean, I think that the evidence is still being collated on that, in the sense that there are certain things about cities in terms of inequalities, in terms of vulnerabilities, in terms of the production of unhealthy lifestyles, which may make certain populations particularly more vulnerable to illness and pandemic. So I think there's certainly connections that need to be thought through. Initially, a lot of the thinking was that, you know, it's density. It's the density of urban life that's the crucial factor here. The comings and the goings and the interactions in public space that led to those initial kind of lockdown strategies of trying to, you know, reverse the normal patterns whereby public spaces are busy and private spaces are quiet, shut down our shopping centres and our train stations and our airports. I think as we go on, I think it's not just to do with questions of density, it is to do with those wider questions of health, of individual healthy lifestyles and resilience, and it's to do with the fact that cities don't always provide the basis for people to lead healthy lives. And again, I think in relation to the things I've been talking about in terms of you know, the contemporary kind of lockdown conditions we're in, for example, in the UK, where people are working at homes and trying to combine home life and working life in environments that simply aren't really in any way healthy. They're stuck in flats with poor thermal comfort, poor insulation, lack of views, natural space, no shared space for exercise. I mean, this is the type of stuff when we look back, I think, and we look at the groups that have been most effective, clearly there will be certain spaces where the virus could spread more easily, such as care homes. But equally, I think we're going to see that those living in particular inner city environments, or in some cases suburban environments, typified by the suburbanisation of poverty, we are going to see a correlation there between incidences of COVID, deaths from COVID, and particularly the presence of precarious workers and minoritised ethnic minorities as well.
Okay, Katharine.
Yeah, so again, I think the way we've seen cities is sort of these sort of often very static, physical, urban environments. You know, they are places we move through, but somehow they don't have capacity to affect our health. We have health and we move around and we choose how to be healthy or less healthy. I think what we've seen is that that cities are also sort of performing a health function. One of the things we've seen is that levels of pollution probably do seem to have some indicator as to how poor some people might respond to COVID, particularly those who've got existing health conditions. So coming back to digital again, I think the idea that we might start to monitor our cities for how they are performing in terms of our health, much like we have a sort of Fitbit or a smartwatch in which we start to see how we're performing, how we monitor our health. I think that the need to sort of understand the healthiness of cities as an ongoing and a much more dynamic characteristics, and much more, you know, if I'm living next to a very busy road, which is very poor levels of air quality, you know, that's going to be a concern. And that those air quality levels aren't always going to be the same. And that won't necessarily be to do with the physical nature of the city. It'll be to do with how the city performs as a space, you know, what's happening within it. So I think that level of concern for how I start to interact with my city as a space of health, which performs in a certain way, that may start to become something which we become much more actively involved with and less seen as something that someone else deals with, and is less, you know, 50 years time we might change it, but you know, this should happen. We need to change our behaviour in order for that, the way that the city is inhabited, and experienced in a sort of health sense.
If I can come in there actually, Mark, and just say
yeah,
that
sure.
I think the monitoring there is the start of identifying a particular set of problems. And I think what we see during COVID and lockdown is we have city dashboards now giving us a range of information that in a sense we've never been able to have that level of information in front of us before. And I think as we begin to analyse it, as I say, I think it will begin to expose things like environmental racism within our cities, whereby minoritised populations have to live in the most polluted areas. And here we might think about issues of climate change as well as it relates to that. And so recognising that as a beginning, but I'm not sure the extent to which technocratic solutions or smart technologies give us all the tools we need to think about solving those problems. I think it may be a more fundamental question about equality and the right to the city. So that's where my thinking that environmental monitoring, and we are involved in that type of work at King's, is a good beginning here to identify the problems, but it's not necessarily always the solution.
Yep. I mean, I'd agree with all those comments, really. And I think the idea of thinking of the city as a system and measuring its performance and monitoring its performance, you know, moves us on from just thinking of it as a physical collection of buildings. But I mean, Phil's point about what do we do with that data and who makes the decisions? I think that, you know, that's very important in that context too. I mean, on the question of is it the fault of global cities, the spread of COVID? And I think there was, you know, early on, there was quite a lot of commentary based on not a huge amount of evidence about it's all about cities and density. Maybe it is, but, you know, as my colleagues have said, we've yet really to do the serious analysis of this. In relation to that, I just point out that some global cities, Tokyo, Singapore, Shanghai, you know, even Sydney, in a kind of different context, you know, have done rather better than, you know, large cities in Western Europe and North America. So, you know, good topics to explore, but I think, you know, the data on that is still coming in. Just kind of, you know, building on that in terms of thinking a bit about policy, one of the questions from the audience, health and well-being must be at the forefront of any city redevelopment. How do we influence both private developers and public agencies to build in healthier cities as we go forward? Who would like to pick up on that?
I may defer to Katharine on this one.
So just to clarify, we're thinking about how might this affect how we think about the design of cities in the future? And
yes, I mean, to use the cliche, I've tried avoiding it up to now, but anyway, build back better seems to be a good slogan of everybody along the political spectrum. But how do we actually build back better, specifically in terms of thinking about people's health, you know, their physical health, public health issues, mental health as well, picking up on some of the points that Philip was making earlier?
Well, I mean, if we think about global cities like London, you know, that if there's a real challenge about who's building back better and who makes those decisions, because you know, most of the property market in London is purely speculative. So I can't imagine if the sense that there is still some sense of civicness in how we see what building back better is. So if this does cause us to reconsider who is building back the city and for whom, because you know, we've generally seen cities, the built space as a site of speculation and a site of, you know, making money. It's an asset. What we've seen with the pandemic is that asset can be massively problematic if we haven't actually understood the impacts it might have on our health. So I mean, obviously we can look at policy in terms of how we might start to define requirements. I mean, Phil mentions a living space. You know, a key thing in London, if we think about global cities, is the decline in public space and the access that people have locally to, say, green space or space locally to them. And I think making that much more, realizing that that's not just a thing that falls by the wayside because the real estate developers choose not to engage with that debate because it must make them money. So yeah, if we continue to see cities as assets in a sort of global economy and not as spaces in which we live and that have are sustain us, then the design, we need to change, because we can get all the best designers in the world. We will need people to engage with the idea of who's building that city back and how we can bring that. I mean, bringing it back to, I talked about this idea of neighbourhood. So I think if we could start to bring this much more back to civic-led urban design, and how people sort of build their communities together in a sort of co-design approach, that's generally been seen as one of the ways in which you can address that.
Okay. To come back to that idea of building back better, if I may, Mark, sorry.
Yeah, no, please do, yeah.
Build back better, I mean, it's a lovely phrase, but unfortunately, I think in the UK, for example, and apologies to those internationally, we seem to have this mantra coming from Boris Johnson and others that it's build, build, build. And the idea seems to be that we can build our way out of the COVID recession, which kind of reproduces a kind of COVID capitalism. And the idea seems to be if you build more, you're going to create more affordable homes. The trouble is the way that you make homes affordable is not to build more and more. It's to make them affordable by subsidising them. And we don't have subsidised housing in the UK anymore. So I think the emphasis should be on building back better. And I think it should be about returning to subsidies, recognising that the working poor in London are in the gig economy, but vital, as we've seen, in the front line of cities when in lockdown, with the Uber drivers and the Deliveroo and all the rest of it. These people keep the economy running, but they cannot afford housing in the private rental sector in London, and building more and more of it's not going to help. And at the same time, we're knocking down good council estates in London and handing them over to the private sector. So I know that some people will go, well, isn't council housing dead? What's this idea of subsidy? Why should we subsidise housing for the poor? Well, actually, in terms of social sustainability and the long-term economic prosperity and sustainability of London and other major cities, that's exactly what you should be doing, and it's what happens elsewhere.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, another topic that's come in via the Q&A is about the impact of climate change. One question, cities are a lot lower in energy use per capita than distributed living. Won't the pressures of climate change counter any effects of COVID? In other words, we need to keep being urbanised to some degree, because this is really, if we have a much more distributed population, we're not going to meet our climate change targets. And I think that's a good question, because I think we're in the middle of the pandemic, but we will come through it. In the future, there will be other challenges to city living, and a number of those will be associated with climate change. So what do we think? Are there any lessons in terms of what we're going through now for how we might tackle some of the direct effects of climate change on cities? Who'd like to pick up on that?
I think
I could start. Sorry, Katharine, please.
You go, Phil.
Phil, you go.
I'll say just a few words on that, because I think a lot of what I've been talking about is the return of and the re-densification of city centres. They've become donuts. That's what's happening. Offices will start to move out. Retailing has gone to their donuts. And to kind of make money from them, developers are going to pack them full of housing. And the type of housing that will sell at the moment is housing for the urban poor. It's actually more expensive. You get more profit per square foot than you do designing for the urban elites and the global elites who aren't travelling now. There's been a huge urban exodus of the international population of London in the last 12 months. Around 700,000 people have left. So the demand for that type of housing will decline. So they will put this rabbit hutch housing in there. So that's what I think might happen. And that sounds like that's a good thing, because you're making a dense city that's more walkable and compact. And people have been arguing about the compact and dense city as a good thing for climate change mitigation for years. The trouble is, at the same time, you've got people going on about the 15-minute city and saying we need 15-minute cities, and that's going to be good for the environment. The trouble is, when people think about the 15-minute city, they're thinking about not just where they've got a pharmacy and a pub and some shops within 15 minutes. They're thinking about urban green space, and they're thinking about the places where they can find that, and that is market towns. That's counter-urbanisation, and so I think that's the real challenge here. That this type COVID could lead to a kind of city centre cramming and constructing new housing for the urban poor, and a form of gentrification of the rural that creates the kind of urban sprawl that is counterproductive. So I think that's a real challenge that we need to work through.
Okay, Katharine.
Yeah. So I feel that this sort of the move to the market towns, maybe not market towns, but the move beyond the big the sort of large scale global as our model of what urban may be, and to other models of urbanness that may be with the regional and the rural. Again, the sort of collapsing of these quite binary ideas of what urban and rural is. 15-minute city, again, I mentioned if we're thinking about the sort of carbon agenda, the low carbon agenda, to some extent, one of the things that we've seen is just a slowness. So the not doing as much of everything that happens. So not as much flying, not as much travelling. All of the actual, the collapsing of that level of activity which a city sustains, and actually sort of just creating a sort of slowness that will enable us to use less resources. And I think, lockdown has, to many, created a sort of pattern of, we may still be working quite actively through Zoom, but there's a slowness in how we occupy our lives that I think many people will not want to go back to that level of the degree to which we are constantly either physically moving around or, consuming resources. So potentially, I think, if we're looking at the climate change agenda and how cities were sort of these frenetic sites of activity in a way, and sort of sustained busyness and cityness being busy. Perhaps if we look at this idea of us putting more effort into or more sustaining our local neighbourhoods and being, maybe this work-life balance being actually something which is not just patterns of what individuals might need to sustain themselves, but might actually create new ways in which we live in terms of a city, which is much more about sustaining our community as part of what a city is, and not just sustaining ourselves as individuals or our own personal lives. So perhaps the slowness and the moving back to what we have locally and sustaining that and committing to that point might start to give clues as to other ways to live that might still be city-like, but a different type of city.
Okay.
I agree. I think we could look back there to 20 years ago when people started thinking about these type of issues, and there was talk about telecottaging, not necessarily a green city idea, but interesting ideas of co-living, cooperative living, sharing workspaces, thinking about the new type of communities we might need. And those ideas seem to have disappeared a little bit. And I think we need to kind of reinvent them. And I say I'm not entirely convinced that the 15-minute city idea is the most productive idea, because it's going to be very quickly co-opted by developers who want to use it to sell a particular type of suburban and ex-suburban development.
Okay, I'm going to disagree slightly with my two panelists here, because although I'd like to think that there's a quieter, gentler form of city living, I suspect in 5 years' time, if we've had vaccines that work and the planes are flying again and the new investment is going into high-speed rail, I think we're mostly going to go back to that. But we can wait and see a bit on this. Now, a very interesting question that came in, which I'm going to slightly kind of reword it to make it more general. But one of the impacts of COVID in providing a whole range of services, which simply weren't there before. So a huge increase in home deliveries, Ocado type services, teleconferencing with your doctor, and so on. This question points to the fact this has an impact in the question says rural areas, but I would say all kind of non-urban areas as well. So perhaps the kind of services which you would have to go to a city to be able to choose from, you know, a dozen types of street food, depending on how you felt this evening. You can get these delivered to your door, you know, almost anywhere now. Is that, you know, picking up on an earlier theme we talked about, is that going to blur a bit more, this distinction between an urban and a non-urban area? You'd like to have a go at that?
I think this sort of, maybe I'll pick up on this because this was sort of part of the point I was making about how the digital collapses some of those, what we mean by connected and what we mean by having access. Yeah. So I can access many things, whether we want to have access to a GP via video call. But practically, if, say, you're an elderly person who cannot physically move to the GP surgery and it's an incredibly time, resource and difficult thing to do, potentially, you know, that may enable me to have more, you know, more access to things. And I mean, unfortunately, what we have on the other side is that the main companies that have benefited from the pandemic are the digital, and these are all global multinationals that have really no interest in what happens about us locally. So I think we need to look at if we are going to rely on these technological networks to sort of resource us, we need to also start acting much more in an enabled way to make those work for us at a local level. You know, we constantly outsource all of that capacity to people who make money out of our data. So that's a negative side, and we need to start building social digital networks that are built within our own communities and that we service and maintain them ourselves. We have very little capacity around that. So the idea, you know, could the community centre also be a digital space as well as a physical space? Can we arrange to deliver parcels among our community through WhatsApp calls or something? So again, WhatsApp's another global national, but you know, how do we start to use those digital networks actually resourcefully ourselves and bring the benefits back into our own communities and not have the benefits go elsewhere?
Okay.
I think if you go back 50 years, Castell's book, The Urban Question, is all about that. Why do cities exist? His answer, they exist so you can bring together populations in the most efficient way to provide them with the services that they need to keep them alive. And this is part of the capitalist system. So in a sense, this is an interesting moment because it does suggest the possibility that we no longer need that kind of density of services. But I'd still argue that really all of these things that we're talking about are actually about unequal access and about splintered networks. And, you know, talk about Ocado. Not everybody can get onto Ocado.
Yeah.
You know, not an established person. Not everybody is lucky enough to belong to a GP that has, you know, telemedicine services. So there's an inequality there. So I still kind of hold to my thesis that the main thing this will be doing is fueling a particular form of COVID and post-COVID capitalism, which actually encourages particular middle-class elites to say, well, why do I need to be in the city to access these services? I can go elsewhere to get those kind of services because I can afford to pay certain people to deliver them to me. So I think there's still a connection there with what I'm calling the kind of the urban exodus, which I know that, Mark, you're suggesting that I may be overstating it, but, you know, I don't think that, you know, we're just going to see a kind of a repopulation by the same type of people.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now we're running out of time, but I've been asked to ask you and me as well, what are our key takeaways on this topic? So, very quickly, what would you like our audience to take away from this discussion? Shall I go first? Give you a chance to think about this. My takeaways are cities are not going to disappear. So, you know, if you look at the historical pattern, cities have survived, mostly in the same place, not entirely, and they've dealt with a huge number of challenges. But cities do get transformed through the experience of dealing with whether it's a pandemic or it's climate change or in the past war or natural disasters. It's very difficult in the middle of dealing with a crisis to actually envisage where we're going and what it's going to look like. One kind of more policy related point I'd make is I just wonder if there's enough thinking going on, not just in the UK, but in governments around the world, about what the next 20, 30, 40 years are actually going to look like in cities. It's obviously crucial to deal with the immediate crisis from COVID, both the health crisis and the economic crisis. But on the other hand, in the Second World War, in the depths of the war, the UK managed to produce the Abercrombie Plan, which was the planning for London and the wider southeast, and the Beveridge Report, which set out the main lines of the post-war welfare state. So I think even in the depths of a crisis, it's important to be thinking strategically about where we want to go. And I'm not sure there's enough of that going on, not just in the UK government, but in governments around the world. All right, Katharine and Phil, I'm not going to let you off the hook because you've had a bit of time to think about it. Katharine, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, so rather than some ideas we have, and to some extent the area which I work in, the smart cities areas, is brings in these sort of utopian ideas that somehow we might have some higher level future which we can buy into. We have created new cities. We have reconfigured how we live radically. So we need to think about how we either can. We aren't going to go back. You know, there is no going back. So what can we take from what we've learnt from how we lived and how we've, again, I've talked about this merging of the digital and the physical, and how new patterns of community, not new patterns, but patterns of community have emerged, which are both local and digital at the same time. So this sort of hyper local sort of idea. How may we continue to take that learning from what we have now, rather than some idea that we have lived in extraordinarily changeful times, and we don't need to go back. We need to go forward, but not in a utopian sense, but in a sense of learning from what we have, what has happened during this time, and what we can take forward meaningfully. And where I would argue, from my sort of the positivity side, is how mutual points of support and community have formed at a local level, and that has been quite transformative for some people.
I agree to a large extent with what you're saying there, I think. I think for me, my takeaway is that COVID has made the inequalities in our cities more and more obvious. And I think it's those inequalities and not COVID that need to be tackled.
Right.
But I don't know if we need big plans like Abercrombie. And I think what I've heard there from Katharine kind of chimes a little bit with what I feel, learning from people like the Fearless Cities Network and experiments in kind of new municipalism. I think we need local experiments. I think we need to do more faith in local communities to work together, to participate in a broad sense in urban life, to occupy spaces and seize urban spaces for themselves, and to make the best of the post-COVID city. So yeah, it's about the right to the city, and it's about a right to participation in cities. And I think I'd rather see a lot more of that than kind of grand plans like Abercrombie and others.
Okay, thanks very much. We could continue, but I'm afraid we're just about to run out of time. I'd like to thank Katharine and Philip for a great discussion. I'd like to thank all of you who are watching this, either live or perhaps later on the YouTube channel. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's certainly been very enjoyable for me. Thank you very much. I'm just going to hand back now. I think Marika may want to make some final comments before we have to depart. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. A huge thank you to our, all of our panelists and our chair today for such an interesting conversation. Thank you to all of you as well in our audience for your participation and thoughtful questions. Before I close today, just a couple of quick reminders from the Alumni Office. As you've heard today, there's a lot of research taking place at King's on this topic. If you would like to find out more about our work, do be sure to let us know in the post-event survey so we can share further resources with you. Next up in the King's Expert series, we'll be discussing the US political landscape in February. Invites for that should be landing in your inboxes shortly. And finally, in these times of social isolation, we're excited to be launching King's Let's Chat, an initiative designed to bring our students and alumni around the world together for a friendly chat. You can find out more information about how to sign up on our website, and also there'll be a link in the follow-up email. Thank you again, and goodbye for now.